Hello, my name is Patrick Scott, and welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of federalism. In our last discussion of the Constitution, I pointed out that federalism was one of the basic principles embodied in our Constitution. As you will recall, we talked about how the Founding Fathers tried to disperse political authority horizontally through the separation of powers and vertically through the concept of federalism. In our discussion, I also pointed out how the 10th Amendment, that is the Reserved Powers Clause, guarantees a measure of state autonomy and sovereignty that has endured throughout the history of our government. Now today we're going to delve more closely into the concept of federalism. Since the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, I would argue that the single most persistent source of political conflict has been in terms of revolving around the relationships between the national and state governments. The political conflict over slavery was, in large measure, a conflict between states' rights and the national government. But even beyond that, conflicts over how business was to be regulated or who should be responsible for particular government programs largely involved the conflict between the national government and the role and the responsibility of the states. In short, this is what, in my view, federalism is all about. It's the relationship between the national government and the states, and federalism has long been a central feature of American politics, and it continues to be an important feature even today. Now, to understand exactly what we mean by federalism, it may be useful to show what federalism is not. Let me put up a graphic here that shows you some of the different types of systems of government. Essentially, when you think about the national and state and regional governments operating together, there are essentially three types of systems, and the world over, you see these systems in operation. Let me give you this first one here, a unitary system. As you will see here, a unitary system is where power is centralized at the national level. There may be state or regional governments, and if they exist, they derive their authority from the central government. Some examples would include, for example, France, Israel, South Africa, and even states within the USA. They're organized according to a unitary system. I know that may be a little bit of a confusing concept talking about states being organized that way, but they are. States actually are unitary systems of government when you look at the states themselves. But the idea behind this, a unitary system, is that all power is centralized at the national level. And I'll give you an example of this, just to show you what we're talking about. Let's say we're over in France, and at a given time of the day, the top director of the Department of Education over in Paris could look at his or her watch at, say, 10 o'clock in the morning and be able to tell you what all children in the 4th grade are learning at that point in time. In other words, everything that is done really flows from and is coordinated and centralized through the national government. Again, there may be states that operate in this unitary system. There may be regional governments that operate. Certainly there are cities that operate, but all the power and the authority resides at the national level. If there is any power and authority given to the state or regional governments, it is given to them by the national government. So that's one extreme we might talk about, and again we see that in operation around the world today. Let me give you the opposite end of that, and that is a confederal system. A confederal system is also known as a confederation. In a confederal system, power is held by independent states. There may be a central or national government, but if there is, that central government is a creation of the regional governments. Some examples of that would be the United States under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederate States of America. But you didn't know that why were we called the Confederacy, or the Southern States were called the Confederacy, was because of the fact that they were operating according to a confederal system. It's the states that called the shots. The national government, or if there was a central government, it basically was a creation of the states. So the national government under a confederal system derives its power from the states. It is dependent upon the states for its survival. The states are sovereign, and the national government is allowed to do only what the states or regional governments permit. Now, a hybrid between a unitary system and a confederal system is a federal system, and that, of course, is what our system of government is based upon. In a federal system, naturally, power is divided between a central government and local, state, or regional governments. Both the central government and regional governments as well act directly upon the citizens, and both the national government as well as the regional or state governments must agree to any kind of constitutional change. So, for example, not only the United States is a federal system, but also Canada, Australia, India, Germany, Switzerland are other examples of federal systems. Now, we adopted, of course, a federal system of government where we're sharing power between the national and the state governments. And no matter what type of system we're talking about, there are obviously arguments in favor or against each one of those. But since we're talking about, in our system, a federal system, let me just limit our discussion to that particular level. And I'd make the arguments as this in terms of arguments for and against a federal system. Let's first of all focus on some of the disadvantages, arguments against a federal system. Why is a federal system bad? And by the way, when you start thinking about some of the advantages and disadvantages of a federal system, those obviously correlate with some advantages and disadvantages of a unitary system or confederal system. For example, just to show you what I mean by that, a disadvantage of a federal system might be an advantage of a unitary system. And I think you'll follow that as we go along. So let me show you, first of all, one of the disadvantages of a federal system. Under a federal system, states have a lot of power. And under our system, we do allow states much power. And because of that, our states can block important national policies such as, for example, civil rights during the 1950s and 60s. In fact, during that time, many southern states were trying to block desegregation despite what the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education. Just to refresh your memory, in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that that segregated schools were unconstitutional. And it said that states should move with all deliberate speed toward desegregation or toward integration. And what I give you an example of, just in terms of my own experience, is to show you how the states have power in this regard. In 1954, the Supreme Court said, move with all deliberate speed toward instituting desegregation. Where I grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina, we had about 40% population African American. And in my elementary school, we had plenty of pockets of African American. It was clearly a segregated community, but we had plenty of African American neighborhoods around my school. Now, I was going to school, I was in elementary school 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education. So that was 1954. 15 years after that, in 1969, in my elementary school, despite the fact that we had 40% African American communities, despite the fact that we had many of those communities very, very close by to that school, there was not one African American student in my school. 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the Spartanburg, South Carolina School District was still dragging its feet and not allowing for desegregation. It was still very, very segregated. And it wasn't until a few years later that we began to become more integrated. But again, the reason why I suggest this to you is that the states did and still do have a lot of power to block important national policies. And I think that's just one good example of showing how the power of the states can actually be very, very paramount in blocking certain policies. of the national government. Let me give you another example, potentially, of a disadvantage of federalism. And this kind of relates to the idea that when you have pockets of power at the state and local levels and you don't have a whole sense of accountability, a lot of things could happen that might actually deprive people of their rights. And again, I'll be happy just to relay one of my own experiences too. Since I'm talking about the South here, I lived in South Carolina, but also lived in Georgia for a while too. As a teenager, I moved to Georgia with my parents. And we were living in this small town in South Georgia, and we lived next to a doctor who was from Massachusetts. And this doctor always had this very strong Massachusetts accent. And as you might imagine, he wasn't very much accepted by the local townspeople. He'd been there for a number of years practicing medicine, but he never really was fully accepted by the people in that small town. His strong accent always gave him away as being one of those, quote, damn Yankees. And interestingly, after living and working down in this rural area for a number of years, this doctor and his wife decided to move back to Massachusetts. And interestingly, and this is a true story, on the day that he had packed up and was heading out, driving his station wagon, leaving this small town, he got almost to the county line. And when he got to the county line, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw some flashing blue lights. Well, these were sheriff's deputies. The sheriff's deputies got out of the car, went to his car as he was pulled over. The doctor rolled down his window. The sheriff's deputy said, "Do you mind stepping out of the car, sir?" And the doctor says, "Well, what did I do? What was my violation?" The sheriff's deputy says, "I said, step out of the car. Get out now." And this was in broad daylight, but in the middle of nowhere. So the doctor decides, does step out of the car. And again, he asks, he says, "So, officer, what was my infraction? What did I do wrong? Why are you pulling me over?" And one of the sheriff's deputies says, "Oh, you didn't do anything wrong. We just wanted to give you a going away present." Whereupon they proceeded to beat the crap out of him. They punched him, they kicked him, they bloodied him up pretty badly. And his wife was in the car and she was horrified. But she just screamed, but there was nothing that she could do. He got back in the car. He wasn't unconscious. He got back in the car, and interestingly, instead of turning around and going to the hospital where he could be treated by his fellow colleagues, he just kept going north. He went to the next county and went to the hospital there. Now, I had not heard about this until a couple of weeks later after they had moved. My parents were talking to them on the phone, and they relayed this incident to my parents. And as a young teenager, I was outraged. It's like, how could you let them get away with this? Why don't you take them to court? Why don't you do something about this? And my parents basically said, they asked him the same thing, and he told my parents, he said, basically, what good would it have done? Would he have gotten a fair trial? And the point here is simply, under some circumstances, you think about sort of backwater or backwoods kinds of justice, in a system where you have a lot of power that can go unchecked at the local or state level, this can happen. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of rural Georgia is bad or anything like that, but I'm just simply suggesting that sometimes people can get away with things because there is no overarching national accountability. And again, when you reserve a lot of power at the local level, sometimes justice just does not occur for many, many people, and they live under those kinds of systems. Hopefully less and less, but again, that very much can be the case. Another disadvantage that you could suggest here, that in terms of a federal system that goes along with the federal system, is this. Because the states have a lot of power, they can enact laws the way they see fit. Now, that may actually seem like an advantage, but let me talk about the downside of it first. These big variations in how people are treated it can be allowed in terms of law enforcement and justice. And let me give you a couple of examples about that, all right? In Michigan, for example, if you happen to be driving and you're happen to possess in your car, and this is not any endorsement by any means, if you happen to have more than 650 grams of cocaine, which is about 1.5 pounds of cocaine, if you are in Michigan and you get caught with 1.5 pounds of cocaine, that carries a mandatory life sentence. Now, let's say that you happen to be racing to the border and you make it across the line to a neighboring state. Now it becomes a question of federal jurisdiction. And under federal jurisdiction, this crime is only 10 years. And if you're in Alabama, what do you think the penalty there is? Are they going to hang you? No. Interestingly enough, in Alabama, the same crime is only 5 years. The point here is, why is it then, on the one hand, there's a mandatory life sentence in one state for the very same crime, whereas in the federal jurisdiction it's 10 years, and in a given state it's only 5 years? But we can talk about other aspects too, but besides different laws, other kinds of things that you might see. I'm reminded of, for example, in Florida or New York, if you're talking about a minor's access to an abortion, there are no restrictions on a minor's access to abortion, but if you're in Pennsylvania, a minor has to obtain the consent of a parent or find a judge who is willing to waive that kind of requirement. If you look at, in terms of another example of some differences between states, monthly public assistance, we have a program in place called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, TANF. And the amount of monthly assistance that go from one state to another for families can vary quite substantially for a family of 4 from state to state. And again, even though the cost of living may not be that different from state to state, just their resources and policies that they've enacted gives the states a lot of flexibility and discretion in terms of determining what should be the eligibility benefit levels for a family, say a family of 4 who's in need of some kind of assistance. Food stamps and so forth. So the point here is that since you have a lot of variations, and a lot of power left to the state and local governments, there can be a lot of variations in terms of how people are treated from one state to another. Let me give you a fourth disadvantage that some people cite regarding our federal system. Because there is a lot of variation from state to state, some states and local governments may simply lack the necessary expertise and the money to accomplish important goals. And so what that may mean, because they don't have the resources, that means a person who may come out of a high school, graduate from a high school in a rural area of Mississippi, the level of their training may be vastly different and probably inferior to someone who's coming out of a relatively wealthy community, say in Connecticut. They both have high school, both kids may have high school degrees, but their level of training, their level of understanding, their level of experience, and most importantly, their level of preparation for beyond, say for example college, is vastly different from the two states. And again, that may very well be because of the fact that some states just don't have the resources to carry out important goals such as education. Now, if we're talking about disadvantages of our federal system, let me also talk about some advantages of our federal system. And again, this is just a few here. But one of those disadvantages I just mentioned about big variations from one state to another in terms of how people are treated, well, certainly, as I mentioned, that can also be an advantage. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's look at speed limits. Some states require 55 miles per hour all the way through. For example, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York, 55 miles per hour all the way through. Other states permit 65 in many areas, and even other states permit even higher than that, 70 or 75. Different states have different needs. Some rural areas where you don't have as much traffic, the traffic allowable speed limits tend to be higher than more congested areas. But again, the idea is that states ought to have the flexibility to decide what they should be. I remember when I was going to school and getting my PhD up in New York, I attended Syracuse University. And again, being from Georgia, we would visit our families to Georgia, go to home to Georgia for Christmas. And I remember going through New York and Pennsylvania and Maryland and going 55 miles per hour all the way through. But I could not wait till I got to the North Carolina border, because that allowed me to go 60 or 65 miles per hour and get home a little bit more quickly. And when we moved here to Springfield, we have family in Oklahoma as well. And I remember when I first visited some family coming from Springfield to Oklahoma, I remember getting on the highway on I-44 and the speed limit was 70. And of course 70 means probably a lot of people go 70 to 75. And while that's a lot for my little car at the time, it was shaking and rattling at 75 miles per hour. There were people going 90 miles per hour past me. But I was just amazed at the difference here in terms of speed limits. But again, it does make sense under our federal system that that the states ought to have the flexibility to allow differences in terms of what they allow, just because they comport more with their own local conditions, local contexts, and design their laws accordingly to fit with those kinds of things. Another advantage of our federal system, and I think this is a very, very important advantage, is that because the states have the power to do things, our system allows the states and local governments to take the lead on policies for which there may not be a national policy, and they can become innovators. And I'll give you some examples of that. California, for example, has clean air standards that have always historically surpassed federal standards. In Michigan and Wisconsin, they've made a lot of important innovations in terms of welfare reform. In healthcare policy and reforms in healthcare policy, I think about Hawaii and what Hawaii and Oregon has done in terms of healthcare reform. And the idea is that states can basically become innovators. In fact, they may be called, a very famous term is called laboratories of democracy. Our federal system allows the states to engage in new innovations, laboratories of democracy. And that can be a good thing because other states can learn from each other. The federal government can learn from what some of the states are doing and adopt national policies based upon these kinds of innovations. Normally, I don't think of Missouri as being the most innovative state, but even Missouri gets some credit for being an innovator. In terms of the court system, we have something called the Missouri Plan, which governs the selection of judges that provide basically a very innovative way to select judges to the state Supreme Court and lower courts that combine popular approval as well as prerogatives of the governor, as well as some professional expertise, all working in together. And we'll talk more about that later on when we talk about the judiciary. But this idea, the Missouri plan for selecting judges to the bench, has been considered an innovative kind of feature that other states have chosen to adopt. And we've had the Missouri plan in place for over 50 years. I think about Parents as Teachers as another example of that. Parents as Teachers is a wonderful program where set up by the state of Missouri and initiated by Missouri, where trained experts in child development can go into homes and basically help new parents, give them some pointers about how to enhance the development of their children, their cognitive development, their speech and language development, their social development. And they will come in and monitor and examine and give hints and suggestions to parents how to encourage development and help their child achieve appropriate developmental milestones. And the idea is parents playing this role as teachers, it helps prepare them for the children as they get older. You know, they have a bigger boost. Other states have looked at Missouri as being an innovator in terms of parents as teachers. So again, I look at Missouri in some respects as being, in that way, as being a progressive state in terms of helping to achieve some of these innovations. And other states have seen this. But the larger point, of course, then, is that states can become laboratories of democracy, laboratories of experimentation, where we can learn from each other, and that can be a good thing. That's how we can have and improve our public policies at not only the state levels, but also at the national level too. So it's good that states have the right to engage in experimental policies. And even now what we see going on, the federal government's encouraging states to consider, for example, in terms of healthcare reform, different kinds of policies where we learn from each other and try to make improvements in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So, in short, states can become these laboratories of experimentation in policy making. A third advantage of our federal system is as follows. Federalism is good because it provides widespread opportunities for political participation. It makes it easier for you as a citizen to participate in our system. You're not limited, like a unitary system, you're not limited to simply participating at the national level. But because we have a federal government, we have state governments, we have county governments, we have local governments, we have school boards, all park boards, all kinds of governmental entities, it's very easy to participate in our political system. And the nice thing about that, so many political scientists have noted this, is that the more opportunities you have as a citizen to participate, the more it increases your sense of political efficacy. Political efficacy is a concept that people have in terms of their sense about, do they have an ability to change or influence the system? So people who've participated in government, who've played a role, who grew up in households where people have talked about politics, or they know people who are running for office, or they've played a role in terms of serving on school boards and different kinds of things like that, they tend to have a greater sense of political efficacy. And political scientists have suggested that the higher the level of political efficacy a society has, the better that is for democracy. The more that enhances our democratic ties and is good for democracy. It strengthens democracy. And the opposite of that is when people don't have a sense of political efficacy, when they think that all decisions are being made by other people and that they can't be involved, they can't play a role, and they're on the outside, they're disenfranchised from the system, that has a corrosive effect on our democracy. So that, certainly to a lot of political scientists and others, political efficacy is a good thing. And our federal system, because it provides so many different opportunities to participate, so many widespread opportunities, that is actually good for our system of government because it does enhance political efficacy. Another way, so those are some advantages and disadvantages of our federal system. Now, let me shift and talk to you a little bit about another way of looking at federalism. And that is, if you think about this, it's a lot of ways a debate between national control and state and local discretion. In other words, a lot of what federalism is all about is how much power should be at the federal level and how much power should be at the state and local governments. Again, even going back to the very first time we were discussing in the introductory material this topic of federalism, the idea here is how much power and in what area should government authority be vested. We were talking about the idea of what levels of government should be responsible for what functions and how much power should each level have. So let's take a look at education, for example. Education is a responsibility certainly at the federal, state, and local levels. Probably the local level has the greatest responsibility for carrying out, for educating our children. But certainly the state government plays a very important role, and the federal government does too. But when we see all three entities, or throughout all three levels, playing a role here, one of the questions becomes, to what extent should the federal government play more of a dominant role, or is it playing too much of a dominant role right now? Should we have, for example, a national exam for all students to pass so that no matter whether you're a kid graduating in California schools or you're graduating from schools in Connecticut or Florida or Mississippi, should there be a national exam that provides a basic level of competencies that all students should have to pass? Now, a lot of this goes back to your philosophies of governance. Are you more of a Hamiltonian or more of a Jeffersonian at heart? If you are more of a Hamiltonian, just show how we can tie some of these ideas together. If you are more of a Hamiltonian at heart, then you're going to believe in the idea of a strong national government. And you're probably at the same time going to be arguing for greater national standards. A Hamiltonian might be willing to argue for greater national standards. A Jeffersonian, by contrast, an anti-federalist, by contrast, might be willing to say, no, you have to understand that there should not be a national exam. We don't need to have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. dictating what our kids learn. That's your typical kind of response you may hear from some parents who are opposed to greater national or federal intervention in our education. They say that basically school districts at the local level ought to have the right to determine for themselves what should be the standards that are appropriate for that area. Or if nothing else, at least states ought to have the primary responsibility for making these determinations. So again, you can look at education as one small example of showing how this debate between national control versus local / state discretion plays out. How much control should there be at the national level versus the state level? We can take other examples as well. What about health care? Let's think about training for doctors and doctors being able to practice. You know, if you're a doctor, you have to take state boards and you have to basically be certified to practice in the state in which you reside and which you're practicing. Should doctors be able to practice in one state but not be able to practice in another state? In other words, Can some states have such different, vast disparities in terms of how they construct their state board exams so that maybe in one state a doctor could be declared incompetent to practice, where in another state the doctor will have no problem at all practicing and easily pass these state boards and practice and have a license to operate in their state? So again, should you have a state-by-state determination, or should this be more of a national issue where basically there should be some kind of national certification that basically all doctors have to have in their specialties to show and demonstrate competence? What about in terms of environmental laws? This is another example in terms of different public policies. Should the same environmental laws apply from one state to the next? In other words, if you happen to be the owner of a plant and your manufacturing facility gives off certain air pollution, should you be able to operate in one state but not another? And the idea is saying you can operate in one state because their standards and their requirements allow you to pollute up to a certain amount, where another state does not. Should there be a uniform standard across the nation that basically says if you're polluting at this level, you have to curb back your pollution regardless? Or should you be allowed to be in one state versus another? We think about, for example, some controversies in this area like acid rain. Acid rain, as you may know, is caused by the emissions from coal. And in the Midwest, there are many coal-fired generated plants, and even like, for example, to produce electricity. Here in Springfield, we have a coal-fired generated electric plant, and there are different kinds of coal. Some coal actually pollutes more and contributes more to acid rain than others. And we're pretty good, and we've made some progress in that regard. But there are other places in the Midwest where the coal that they use actually contributes pretty strongly to acid rain. And what happens is that those particulates get in the atmosphere, and as they head northeastwardly winds directions, it forms into acid rain, and acid rain can have a really deleterious effect on the foliage in some of the forest areas of the Northeast. And so, the arguments that the spillover effects that take place in one state is a justification for saying that you ought to have some more stringent controls, maybe a national control that prevent any kind of deforestation that comes about through acid rain. Clearly, there are no easy answers, but these examples do reflect this debate between the need for national uniform standards and thus some kind of national control versus the need for local or state discretion. Now, in a way, what I tend to look at is that you can look at how much national uniformity versus how much state and local control as a pendulum that swings back and forth. And what we've seen really since about 1994 is the pendulum has swung back toward the idea of more and more state and local control. Back in 1994, that was considered a watershed year when we had the Republicans control the House of Representatives for the first time in over 45 years. And one of their premises or their platforms and why they were elected was that they promised they had a contract with America. It was a 10-point platform, and one of those points in the platform was the idea of giving the states more local control, more control and more discretion. So there should be more local control, more state control, less involvement by the federal government. And I think what you're going to see happening here is that, and over time since 1994, you've had more and more responsibilities turned over to the states. Now, what ends up happening in the process over time is that you begin to see more and more variation, more and more changes from one state to the next, to the point that people begin to start seeing inequities and lack of uniformity, and they begin to call for more national control. So in a lot of ways, you see over time, and we can look at different points in time to illustrate this, but you see almost like this debate as a pendulum that swings back and forth, away from maybe a Hamiltonian model where the national government has a lot of control, and you see a lot of that basically in the 60s and the 1970s, and then moving away in the 80s and the 90s away from that more toward a Jeffersonian model of governance. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to change, and does it shift back and forth, maybe perhaps more toward a Hamiltonian model over time as well. So that'll be something interesting to see how that evolves. But again, you see a lot of ways, though, that is in many ways a good example of, in a nutshell, of what this whole debate about federalism is all about. So I hope this helps to help you understand a lot of what the whole debate about federalism is in terms of this national uniformity versus state and local control, and how the emphasis of that does change over time. Now, the next time when we come back, we're going to talk about how federalism has evolved over time. We'll be talking about a couple of important court cases as well, and then after that, we'll even talk about how federalism has evolved in modern times, and we'll be talking more specifically about some of the monetary implications of federalism, something called fiscal federalism, when we come back next time. Thank you.